بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back to our final lecture in this module, inshallah, in which we will complete the discussion of Masalik al-Illa, the pathways of the ratio legis. So inshallah, in today's lecture, we are going to do the final list, which is 6 through 10. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So these five. First, we're going to talk about similarities, الشبه. And this is a difficult, it's not difficult to discuss, inshallah, or to read in the text, but it's difficult to actually do because you're dealing with a legal issue and it kind of looks like this and it kind of looks like that. That's why it's a shabah. It's kind of between the two. He even said it's a station in between the two stations. So we're going to look at that. And we are going to look at the different levels of similarity. So sometimes it's a full similarity, sometimes unfortunately it's a partial similarity, or it's even less than that, which makes it difficult. That's number 6. Number 7, we're going to look at circulation, al-dawaran, in which you establish the ratio legis, the illa, so therefore you establish the ruling, or you don't establish the ratio legis, so therefore the ruling is suspended. And we will talk about what will happen if there's opposition from an opposing party. Remember, school A and school B again. Then we're going to talk about number 8, rejection, which is without making an appropriate link between the ratio legis and the illa. And then we will also mention that most scholars of usul reject this type as a pathway to the illa. Then number 9, we will talk about, to clarify what surrounds a ruling, which is tanqih al-manat. Underneath that, we'll also look at tahqiq al-manat. And this is another way of establishing the ratio legis through ijtihad. And then number 10, we will look at canceling the difference. So when there are two things, or one thing is mentioned, or multiple things are mentioned, we'll drop the differences between the two and keep the parts that are linked to them. Of course, all of these, inshallah, I'll do my best to give you examples. And then following that, we will look at the conclusion, which he gives us 2 more pathways to the ratio legis which are rejected. This will conclude this lecture, inshallah, and this module. See you back here for the discussion, inshallah. So we begin the way we normally begin, which is to say, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. السادس الشبه. So this is number 6, similarities. وهو مشابهة وصف للمناسب والطردي ويسمى الوصف بالشبه أيضا وهو منزلة بين المنزلتيهما في الأصح. So he says, in similarity, if one can not establish a ratio, I was reading another line. So the shabah is a ratio legis that is between affirming and non-affirming in a ruling. So it looks like one and it doesn't look like one, but it's between the two. It is also called a description by similarity, and in the dominant opinion, it is a middle way between the two I just mentioned. So in reality, it looks like one and it might not look like one. So in other words, the mujtahid leans towards one similarity versus another. So is this a pen or is this a marker? I'm just making it up. Pretty sure it's a pen, but sometimes it can be a marker if you're highlighting or something like that. But I think it's between. So therefore, when I say that, maybe this is not the best example because obviously this is a pen. I've been using it throughout the course, but when you say that, then what he's saying in reality, then it's between the two. And that's why it's going to lead to not necessarily, it's an issue of ijtihad, and then therefore there can be a rebuttal to that. ولا يصار إليه إن أمكن قياس العلة وإلا فهو حجة في غير الصوري في الأصح. This pathway is not used, this similarity, we don't use it if a clear ratio legis can be used in analogy. Otherwise, it can be used other in the example he gave in the dominant opinion, it is a proof. So, because it's embedded in this approach is doubt, because it looks like this but it might not look like this. Somebody else can argue, well, no, it looks like this, it doesn't look like this. So if you can find a pathway to the illah based on a clear ratio legis, yani the illah is clear and the ruling is clear, then we're going to obviously prefer that. So we're not going to use this in the case when something is clear. You can use it and it is a proof, and Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu used it. If you can then establish that it is between two legal issues. Imam Shafi'i used this, for example, in arguing that the intention is required in tayammum. Now, tayammum, as we know, does not lift the hadath. It is only istibahat as-salah. It's only used to allow the prayer. And because the tayammum has the deficiency of that, there are restrictions to the tayammum. So we know that we can only pray the fard and its associated sunnahs. So if I have to make tayammum for dhuhr, I have to wait for dhuhr time to come in. I can't make tayammum beforehand. And then when I pray dhuhr with the tayammum, I can pray the sunnahs before it, dhuhr, and then the sunnahs after it. And then after that, khalas, the tayammum expired. When it comes to asr, even if I haven't lost my wudu, quote unquote, I haven't used the bathroom or passed wind or something like that, still have to make another tayammum. So tayammum is not really like wudu, but it is like wudu because it allows you to pray. So there's a shabah. So Imam Shafi'i used that to say, well, because it's similar, because tayammum is similar from a certain angle to wudu, you also have to use the niyyah. And of course, other people will not accept this proof text. وعلاه قياس ما له أصل واحد فغلبت الأشباه في الحكم والصفة فالحكم في الصفة. And then he says the highest form of this type of approach is that which has one similarity. So there's one aspect that's similar that makes it easier. Then in descending order, then analogy using a similarity in a ruling and description. Then below that is analogy using similarity only in the ruling, and then an analogy using the similarity in the description. So you can see in the descending order that the highest form, as he says, قياس ما له أصل واحد عفوا. So the highest form is that in which which has one similarity. I'm trying to give you the example. I'm just trying to read this here. Like if you say removing filth, removing the najasa as a requirement for prayer is like tahara for the prayer. So there is a similarity in them because you have to use water to do that. That has one asl, that has one example. And then the other ones are in descending order, as we mentioned. Okay. Number 7, الدوران بأن يوجد الحكم عند وجود وصف ويعدم عند عدمه وهو يفيد ظنا في الأصح ولا يلزم المستدل. Well, let me get to that point in a second. So he says, rahimahullah, circulation, where the ruling exists when the ratio legis exists, and the ruling does not exist when the ratio legis does not exist. This leads to partial knowledge in the dominant opinion. Okay, so we've identified the illah, And then we said that one of the definitions of the illah is that when it exists, the ruling exists, and when it doesn't exist, the ruling doesn't exist. So this is why I translate it as circulation. So I think of it like as atoms and like electrons. The illah circulates, or circumambulates, or whatever the right word is, revolves around the ruling in its existence and non-existence. And then he says that in the dominant opinion, it leads to partial knowledge, because the illah might not have been the illah, it might have been a necessary description of the ruling. And so that's why we said looking for the illah, like the detective looking for the illah, it's a very precise thing, because the illah, is it really the illah? Or have you determined it's a description, or have you determined, like for example, the smell of alcohol. The smell of alcohol is not the illah. So just because you smell alcohol doesn't mean that you can confirm that there is alcohol or it's been consumed illegally or something like that. The illah behind the prohibition of alcohol is the iskar, is the intoxication. Now, people can be intoxicated in other things than alcohol, so that's another opposite way of looking at it, where the illah permeates another ruling. We talked about that being possible. But in this case, just because you find the illah does not automatically, usually it does, but not automatically, it doesn't mean that you found the ruling, and that's why he says it leads to partial knowledge. And then he says, ولا يلزم المستدل به بيان انتفاء ما هو أولى منه. So the one engaging in the mujtahid that's going to do this type of pathway, and the one undergoing this type of analogy does not demonstrate the inability of a higher form of analogy. It does not have to, sorry. And the one undergoing this type of analogy does not have to, let's make a correction here, does not have to demonstrate the inability of a higher form of analogy. So you can use this, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the best tool in the toolkit, and that there's a better form of analogy, so the one engaging in this can engage in it in that way. Now, how about oppositions? ويترجح جانبه بالتعدية إن أبدى المعترض وصفا آخر. I'm running out of time, but let me read it quickly and we'll go back to it. If the opposition is brought forth with a short ratio legis, so somebody said, this is from the commentary, I ran out of time. Let me just do this one in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so just to review, we're talking about circulation, and we're reading the line about opposition. So he says, rahimahullah, if opposition is brought forth, for example, with a short ratio legis, preference is given to this analogy through circulation, since it becomes a legal issue of multiple ratio legis. So you've established the illah, and then you say that the illah is circulating with the ruling in existence and non-existence, and then somebody says, well, there's another illah. So I don't have to succumb to that objection, because I can say, well, then it's a legal issue that has multiple ilal, because that is a possibility. والأصح إن تعدى وصفه إلى الفرع واتحد مقتضى وصفيهما أو إلى فرع آخر لم يطلب الترجيح. The correct opinion is that if multiple ratio legis are brought to the same legal issue, but the ruling is the same, no tarjih or no preference is required. Why? Because one issue, well, first of all, it's the same result, and they're just multiple ilal going to the same legal issue. So in that case, you don't have to prefer one over the other. Okay. Number 8, الطرد or rejection بأن يقارن الحكم الوصف بلا مناسبة ورده الأكثر. To compare a ruling and its description without an appropriate link, and most scholars of usul reject this. So the example he gives is kind of ridiculous, but it took me a while just to realize how ridiculous it was. So he says, okay, so vinegar is a liquid, and then it's pure and we're able to use it. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, what a great condiment is vinegar. And we talked about that in the fiqh class. So he said vinegar is a liquid because, so here's the illah, because you can build a bridge over it, just like you can build a bridge over water. Okay, it doesn't matter what you're going to say next. That's not the illah for anything in fiqh, or in this issue. It doesn't. It's a liquid. So liquids, automatically in your mind, you think of liquid, qullatayn, najasa. If the najasa has a circulating blood in it or not, that's where your mind goes as a faqih or as a mujtahid. You're not thinking about is there bridge. So he's like, well, there's no link between the two. So he's saying, that's an example. That now you can, I guess you just have to. We can leave it there. That's why you see why people would reject that. Okay, number 9, tanqih al-manat. Tanqih al-manat is to clarify what surrounds a ruling. الشيء ينيت بالشيء. When something is munit with something, it is surrounds it, ihata, or is close to it. So he says, rahimahullah, بأن يدل نص ظاهر على التعليل بوصف فيحذف خصوصه من الاعتبار بالاجتهاد ويناط بالأعم أو تكون أوصاف فيحذف بعضها ويناط بباقيها. So تنقيح المناط, clarifying what surrounds a ruling, is when a clear text indicates the ratio legis with a description, so its specifics are dropped from consideration via ijtihad and held to the surrounding generality, or when there are several descriptions and some are dropped but others are kept. So the first example, here he's going to deal with the hadith in which the Arabi, which the Bedouin man came to the Prophet ﷺ and complained that he had sexual intercourse with his wife during the day of Ramadan, to which the Prophet ﷺ, this is called al-kafara, the big expiation, in which you have to free a slave if you can't, you fast 60 consecutive, etc. So he says, Imam Abu Hanifa and Malik radiallahu anhuma, they removed from this the description that this took place in Ramadan. They took away from this the description of the sexual act and held to that this is the expiation for just breaking your fast without a valid reason. Whereas for us, obviously in the Shafi'i madhab, we see this as something very specific. So the specifics here are dropped by Abu Hanifa and Malik radiallahu anhu. What's the specific? That it was intercourse. So they're saying that doesn't matter. What matters is that this is the expiation for iftar. The second example, the same story, the same hadith. Imam Shafi'i dropped the specific description that it was an Arabi, that it was a Bedouin tribe. So that's not important for the ruling. What's important is the act, which was the sexual act in the month of Ramadan, in the day of Ramadan, afwan. And the fact that his wife can also be dropped. What matters is that one engages in the sexual act in the day of Ramadan, obviously without an excuse. I mean, you broke your fast without your excuse in that way. So these are two examples of what we just read. So let me just read it again now that you have those two examples. So clarifying what surrounds a ruling, when a clear text indicates the ratio legis with a description. So this is a clear text. The man complained about an act that he did in the day of Ramadan, and the Prophet ﷺ gave him the ruling. And we took this hadith before. A clear text indicates the ratio legis with a description. So its specifics are dropped. You can drop some of the specifics from consideration through ijtihad, and you hold the general, the surrounding generality of it, like in the first example of Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik radiallahu anhuma, or when there are several descriptions, like in the second example, a Bedouin slave, a sexual act with one's wife, etc. Those are the specifics. Some of them are dropped, but others are kept. Okay, and then related to this, he said, وَتَحْقِيقُ الْمَنَاطِ or to establish the surrounding legal issue. وتحقيق المناط إثبات العلة في صورة كإثبات أن النباش سارق. So he says, this is to establish the ratio legis in one scenario, like establishing that a grave robber is a thief, and the remaining issue has been discarded. So, the grave robber is somebody in here, and Nabesh is somebody who goes to, which is a really lowly thing, which somebody that goes into the grave and steals the kafan, steals the shroud, because we don't bury things with people like some of the ancient Egyptians and stuff like that. We don't do that. So when you think of grave robber, you're probably thinking of like treasure. But in the Sharia, when we talk about a grave robber, in a Muslim environment, it's somebody who's going to steal the shroud and then resell the shroud from the body, which is astaghfirullah, a very lowly thing. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. So he's saying, well, we're going to link this, we're going to consider this person a thief because he went to a private space, the grave, and stole something. And because we talked about theft and crimes and punishment, it's, if I have something like like the books you see behind you, if I have them like in a cabinet or they're like in a room that has a door, it's protected and you can't go there and just steal it. If you go and you take it without my permission, that means you've stolen something. So that's where the similarity is. So say, okay, the nabesh therefore is a thief, and therefore because he is a thief, and if you can, if the kafan was large enough it reached the nasab, then you can cut off the person's hands. And this is in opposition to Imam Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu. He says, وَتَخْرِيجُهُ مَرْ. As for تَخْرِيج الْمَنَاط, this came in a previous section that we did a couple classes ago. Okay. Now next is cancelling the difference. العاشر إلغاء الفارق كالإلحاق الأمة بالعبد في السراية. Cancelling the difference, like joining the slave girl to the slave man in the injunction on freeing slaves caught in war. So in the hadith, related to this issue about acquiring captives and slaves in warfare, the hadith mentions the slave in the masculine only. But in here, we'll cancel the difference. We'll cancel the difference of the gender, and then the woman slave will be included in the male slave. And we've talked about something similar in previous situations when it comes to the gender specifically. Let me pick it up in the next discussion, inshallah. Okay, so we were just talking about number 10, cancelling the difference. Let me just do that really quickly. So he says, العاشر إلغاء الفارق كإلحاق الأمة بالعبد في السراية, like joining the slave girl to the slave man or to the slave boy. I should have said slave woman. Let me say slave woman to the slave man. And the injunction of freeing slaves caught in war. So even though the text will mention only the slave man, we would allow, through this type of process of cancelling the difference, we'll say it's not just limited to the man, it's a man and a woman. Okay, and then he says, وهو والدوران والطرد ترجع إلى ضرب الشبه. This one, cancelling the difference, circulation, number 7, and rejection, number 8, all go back to similarities, not an actual ratio legis. So 7, 8, and 10, they're about similarities, not about arguing any differences in the ratio legis. Okay, and then he says in conclusion, ليس تأتي القياس بعلية وصف ولا العجز عن إفساده دليلها في الأصح. In the dominant opinion, the following two are not proofs, making analogy through a ratio legis of description. Now, I want to go back to number 6 really quickly. And he says in number 6, when we talked about الشبه, and he says فهو حجة في غير الصوري في الأصح. He says that the similarities, the shabah, or the qiyas, analogy through the shabah. So where's my text here? Is a proof in the dominant opinion, other than making analogy through a ratio legis of description. That's what he's talking about here. So, making an analogy through a ratio legis of description only is not a proof. Let me see if I can get you an example from the other hashiyah. Okay, unfortunately, I don't have a good example for you. And then the second one, he says, our inability to critique a posited ratio legis, our inability to critique a posited ratio legis does not affirm the positive ratio legis. So, if we're school A and school B, and school B is unable to critique the illah that school A brings, this inability to critique does not affirm what school A said. So, obviously, school A is going to come away saying, "Well, you couldn't critique it, right?" But in the absolute, that's not a proof, is what he's saying, or that's not a pathway, or that's not a hujjah. That's not a proof. Just because a school couldn't critique it, there might be another issue. There might be multiple ilal. There might be, a shabah that has not been articulated, and so on and so forth. So these two things, analogy through a ratio legis of description, and inability to critique, are not proofs. Sorry, let me just one more. I know I'm taking a lot of time. We concluded and we have some extra time anyway, so let me just make sure that I'm not missing anything as we wrap this up. Okay, the ratio legis of description, the first one, when he says in the dominant opinion, the following two are not proofs. Number one, making an analogy through a ratio legis of description. Like, for example, that's why you have to have multiple hashiyas. So the example that he gives in this one, that somebody says, if what you have described is the illah, then we will make qiyas over it. That's not a proof, because it's not been established that the description is the illah. Because sometimes the description can be, like we said, a hikmah, or can be mulazim, like the smell of alcohol we said in the previous clip, is not an illah. So just because you've described something, you can't say, well, just in case the description is an illah, then we're going to use it. He's like, that's not a proof. Just likewise, our inability to critique the positive ratio legis does not affirm the positive ratio legis. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So here, inshallah, we conclude this this unit. Of course, we have not concluded the section on analogy, and the next course, in the next module that we have, we'll pick up right where we left off, as if the classes are continued. Now, the reason I did it this way, slightly different than maybe some of the course outlines had initially described, is that, as you can see, that the analogy section, the qiyas section, is very large and very complex. One of the things that's complex is translating these concepts and terms. So sometimes it takes me a great deal of effort, and I ask Allah Ta'ala to help me and to guide me to what is correct. It makes a great deal of effort to find the right approximate English. Sometimes it's clunky, because it's, a lot of these words are very unique only to Usul al Fiqh. It's not even, if you spoke like this to like a normal Arabic speaker, they probably wouldn't understand some of these words. So these are very technical terms, and because analogy in this way and usul al fiqh in this way is a very unique thing to Islam. We're not going to find I mean, da'illah, ratio legis, we got lucky with that. I mean, that concept exists, but not always the case. So I wanted to take our time, and then inshallah we'll be able to conclude it, and indeed conclude the rest of the lectures at the same kind of pace until we get to the allotted time, right before the allotted section, which is right before the issue of Aqidah and Tasawwuf. So we will not be discussing and reading the issues of Aqidah and Tasawwuf, quite simply because in our theology classes in the university, we have discussed all of the theological matters in detail, and we have a standalone class on Tasawwuf. So his dealing in the book with Aqidah, Usul al-Din and Tasawwuf, while important from the concept of they are part and parcel of ijtihad, they are part and parcel of Usul al Fiqh, what's covered in the book is a kind of a summary format. So I don't want you to think that you're necessarily missing anything out by that. Now, if you're lucky enough when you're watching these classes, and Allah Ta'ala gives me tawfiq to actually finish my translation and my corrections, inshallah we'll hope to find a way to make sure that everyone has access to that, so that you can read those final sections on your own. And then when we have a time to meet online in a live session, of course, I'd be more than happy to go through the entire text, the missing sections, so that we could have done it completely. So those are my parting thoughts on this. I hope that inshallah everything was beneficial and clear. Again, this is a topic where you just want to go over it a few times, so you make sure that you understand the concepts. Some of these concepts are new and probably have not encountered them before, either in Islamic studies or just in life in general. But when you think about them and the way that Shaykh al-Islam has, rahimahullah, has described them, you will see that he has done a fantastic job of really laying out the details for us in a very methodological way. And of course, as a reminder, this book is a summary of Jam' al-Jawama by As-Subki, which is like the major book of Usul al Fiqh. And many of the lines that he has are verbatim taken from Jam' al-Jawama, but sometimes he just condenses different concepts, like the differences of opinion. He'll just say in this that qila, but if you go to Lub al-Usul, it will actually tell you who those dissenting opinions are. So this will also prepare you for a larger journey in Usul al-Fiqh. So we'll put a pin in it here, and we'll say والله تعالى أعلى وأعلم وصلى اللهم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.